16 years old, and Clara Boone owned nothing in this world but the clothes on her back, a canvas satchel with 2 mended dresses folded inside, and $9 silver sewn into the hem of her petticoat. It was her stepfather, Silas Prout, who put her out on the road that gray October morning in 1887, not with a shout or a blow, but with a cold civility that cut deeper than either. He simply set her satchel on the porch of the house her own mother had died in 3 weeks before, and told her that a grown girl with no blood tied to his name had no place under his roof any longer. The house, the orchard, the good name of Prout, all of it had passed to him when her mother closed her eyes for the last time, and Clara, who had loved that woman more than her own life, was owed nothing by the law, though she was owed everything by decency. She walked the coast road out of Widow's Point with the wind off the Atlantic biting through her shawl, and by the time she reached the auction notice nailed crooked to a post near the harbor, she had already decided that whatever became of her, she would not go back and beg. The notice said the old lighthouse out on Gull Rock, dark for 11 years, called cursed by half the town and haunted by the other half, was to be sold for the unpaid taxes owed on it, and that no one had come forward to bid. Clara stood there in the cold with her $9 and paid every cent of it for a crumbling stone tower that even the gulls seemed to avoid, and the men at the harbor office laughed behind their hands as they signed the paper over to a girl not yet a woman, with nowhere else to sleep that night. But sealed beneath that lighthouse, in a place no living soul had opened in a generation, lay a truth that would tear the town's respectable history wide open, return what had been stolen from grieving families, and prove that the girl everyone pitied that morning had bought herself a legacy far larger than the house she'd lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Boone. If you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, a home that was taken from you, or a fresh start that looked at first like nothing at all, tell us in the comments, and stay with us, because Clara's story is really only beginning. Clara had not always been a girl with $9 to her name. She had been born in Widow's Point, Maine, in the spring of 1871, the only child of Ruth and Thomas Ashford, and for the first 8 years of her life she had known the particular safety of a house that smelled of wood smoke and salt and her father's pipe tobacco. Thomas Ashford was a fisherman, as most men in that town were, and he had a laugh that carried clean across the water, and hands so weathered and strong that Clara used to press her small palm against his and marvel at how her whole hand disappeared inside the cup of his fingers. It was her mother's father, though, who shaped something quieter and deeper in her, a man named Eli Boone, who had kept the light at Gull Rock for nearly 30 years before Clara was born, and who, even in his retirement, would take his granddaughter out along the tide pools and teach her the names of things the way other grandfathers taught arithmetic. He taught her to read the sky the way sailors did, to know a nor'easter from an ordinary squall by the particular green tint the clouds took on, to mend a net with fingers quick and sure. And most of all, he taught her that a person's worth was not measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to give away when no one was watching. Eli Boone had a saying he repeated so often it became a kind of family scripture. The sea does not care whose hands are soft and whose are calloused. It only cares whether you show it respect, and so should you, with every soul you meet. Clara did not fully understand, as a child, why her grandfather's name was spoken with such careful quiet by the older folk of the town, why some elderly fishermen's wives would press her hand and say only, "Your grandfather was a good man," whatever they said, and then look away before she could ask what they meant. She simply loved him in the uncomplicated way of a child, and when he died in the winter of her 8th year, found at the bottom of the lighthouse stairs, his neck broken, in circumstances the town coroner called a tragic accident and closed the book on within a week, she grieved him with the whole of her small heart, and never once thought to question how a man who had climbed those stairs 10,000 times before could fall on the 10,001st. That same winter, her father's boat, the Constance, went down in a storm off Cape Ledge, and Clara's mother was left a widow with a young daughter and a modest cottage that belonged, technically, to the fishing cooperative her husband had been part of. Ruth Ashford was proud and capable, and she took in mending and sold preserves at the market to keep them fed. But a widow with no property of her own was a fragile thing in a town like Widow's Point. And when Silas Prout, the wealthiest merchant in the county, owner of the cannery and half the wharf, and himself recently widowed, came calling with an offer of marriage, Ruth accepted it not for love, but for the roof it promised over her daughter's head. Clara was 12 when her mother remarried, and she remembered standing in the doorway of the Prout house on her wedding day, feeling the cold marble of the front hall under her shoes and understanding, with a child's unerring instinct, that she had entered a place where she would always be a guest and never quite family. Silas was not cruel to her in those years, not in any way she could have pointed to and named, but he was distant, correct, and utterly uninterested in the granddaughter of Eli Boone, whose name he never spoke without a peculiar tightness around his mouth. Clara grew up in that grand house learning her letters and her needlework, but she kept her grandfather's lessons alive in secret, walking down to the shore on Sunday afternoons to watch the water, to remember the smell of lamp oil and salt that still clung in her memory, to the lighthouse she had visited as a small girl, before it went dark forever after Eli's death. Decommissioned, the town said, because a newer steel light had been built up the coast, though Clara sometimes wondered, without knowing why, if that was the whole truth of it. The fall, when it came swiftly, the way the tide comes in over flat sand, so gradual you do not notice until the water is at your knees. Ruth Prout fell ill in the summer of 1887, with a fever that the town doctor could not name and could not cure, and Clara nursed her mother through 6 terrible weeks, sitting up through nights so long the candle burned to nothing twice before dawn, praying in the particular wordless way of someone too exhausted for proper prayer. Silas visited the sick room dutifully but briefly, and Clara noticed, in the sharp and bitter clarity that grief sometimes lends a person, that he seemed to be waiting rather than hoping. When Ruth died in September, the funeral was small and correct, attended by the town's better families out of obligation to Silas's position rather than any warmth for the woman herself, and Clara stood at the graveside in a black dress that had been her mother's, feeling for the first time in her life entirely and irrevocably alone. She had assumed, in the numb days that followed, that she would remain in the only home she had left, that whatever coldness existed between her and her stepfather would simply continue as it always had. She did not understand, until the morning he set her satchel on the porch, that Ruth had been the only thread holding her to that house at all, and that with her mother gone, Silas Prout considered his obligation discharged. He told her, in a voice so level it might have been discussing shipping tariffs, that she was welcome to write for a character reference should she seek domestic work, and that he wished her well. Clara did not cry in front of him. She picked up her satchel, walked down the porch steps, and did not look back at the house where she had spent 4 years of her life, because she understood, with the sudden hard clarity of the newly homeless, that looking back would not change a single thing about what lay ahead. She had $9, money her mother had, in a rare moment of foresight, sewn secretly into the hem of Clara's petticoat during her illness, whispering that a woman should always have something no one else knows about, and she had the clothes on her back, and she had, though she did not yet know how much it would matter, everything her grandfather Eli Boone had ever taught her. She walked the coast road with no particular destination, past the cannery with its acrid smell of brine and tin, past the harbor where fishing boats rocked at anchor, until she came to the notice board outside the harbor master's office and read, with a strange lurch of recognition, that the old lighthouse at Gull Rock, her grandfather's lighthouse, dark and forgotten these 11 years, was to be auctioned that very afternoon for unpaid taxes, the town having decided it was more trouble than it was worth to maintain a light-no ship needed any more. There was no one else waiting at the auction. The harbor master, a heavy-set man named Obadiah Finch, looked at Clara with open amusement when she stepped forward and asked the price. $9, he told her, expecting her to laugh or walk away, since even the back taxes on the place came to more than most men in town would spend on a whim. But Clara did not walk away. She unpicked the stitches of her petticoat hem right there on the wharf, counted out $9 into Obadiah Finch's startled palm, and signed her name, Clara Ashford Boone. She wrote deliberately, using her grandfather's name alongside her own, though no one there understood why it mattered to her, on the deed that made her, for better or worse, the owner of a crumbling stone tower on a windswept spit of rock a half-mile off the mainland. The men at the harbor laughed, not unkindly but not gently either, and one old fisherman named Cyrus Tate shook his head and told her she'd bought herself a pile of stones and a lot of ghost stories. And Clara only thanked him for the boat ride out, because a lighthouse without a boat to reach, it was no use to anyone. The lighthouse, when she first stepped inside it that evening with a borrowed lantern, smelled of dust and salt and 11 years of silence, and Clara stood in the small, round entry room with her heart beating strangely, as though she had walked into a room her body remembered even though her mind did not. The spiral stairs wound upward into darkness, the same stairs her grandfather had climbed every night of his working life and fallen down on the last night of it, and Clara made herself climb them slowly, lantern held high, until she reached the lamp room at the top, its great glass lens dulled with salt spray and neglect, the mechanism that once turned it seized with rust. She spent that first night wrapped in her shawl on the narrow cot in the keeper's quarters, too tired and too proud to weep, listening to the wind find every gap in the old stonework, and thinking that whatever else was true, at least this roof, however leaky, however cold, belonged to no one but her. It was 2 days later, while searching the small storage room off the kitchen for anything useful, kindling, tools, a working lamp, that she found the first clue. Behind a warped panel of wainscoting that had come loose from the damp, she discovered a narrow gap in the stone, and wedged inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a small leather-bound notebook with her grandfather's unmistakable hand on the flyleaf. E. Boone, keeper's log, private. Clara sat on the floor of that dusty storage room with the notebook in her lap and read entries that were, at first, ordinary enough. Weather observations, notes on the lamp's oil consumption, small complaints about a supply boat running late, until the entries, dated in the months before his death, began to change in tone, growing careful, then fearful, then determined. And Clara realized with a cold shiver that her grandfather had not simply kept a lighthouse. He had kept a secret. The notebook led her, over the following days, deeper into the mystery than she had ever imagined a pile of old stones could hold. Eli Boone had written, in cramped and increasingly urgent script, of a night 11 years before her discovery, a night in November of 1876, when a coastal steamer called the Meridian, carrying the season's final payroll for the fishing cooperative's men, along with a modest cargo of insured goods, had gone down on the rocks near Gull Rock in weather that should not, by any measure Eli understood after 30 years of keeping that light, have caused a wreck at all. The light had been burning, he wrote. He had tended it himself that very evening, and it had been strong and true. And yet in the days after the wreck, the official inquiry concluded that the light had failed, that the keeper had been negligent. And Eli Boone found himself accused, in whispers if not in writing, of causing the deaths of 6 sailors and the loss of a payroll meant for 40 fishing families, who had already spent that winter's earnings against wages that would now never come. Eli's log grew more agitated as Clara turned the brittle pages. He had begun to suspect, and then to gather evidence, that the wreck had not been an accident of weather or neglect at all, but had been arranged. The Meridian's true cargo manifest altered, its insurance claim inflated far beyond the value of what was actually lost, and the difference, a considerable fortune, quietly pocketed by the very man who had underwritten both the shipping company and the insurance policy. Thaddeus Prout, Silas's father, the founder of the cannery, and at the time the most powerful man on that stretch of coast. Eli had written of finding, among the wreckage that washed ashore in the weeks after, a strongbox that should have gone down with the ship, but had instead been quietly rowed ashore in the dead of night before the wreck was even officially reported. He had seen it happen, watched from his lamp room with a spyglass. Two men he could not fully identify, carrying something heavy from a rowboat into the old fish-drying shed behind the Prout cannery. He had confronted no one directly, understanding the danger of accusing a man as powerful as Thaddeus Prout without proof, and instead had spent months quietly gathering what evidence he could. A torn page of the original cargo manifest that did not match the one submitted to the insurers. Testimony he had recorded from a dock hand who'd helped load the Meridian and knew what she truly carried. And astonishingly, the actual gold payroll itself, which Eli had somehow recovered and hidden. Intending to see it returned to the families who were owed it, once he had gathered enough proof to bring the truth before a magistrate who could not be bought. The log ended abruptly in January of 1877, mid-sentence, the final legible words reading, "I will go to Judge Alcott on Thursday next, with all I have gathered, and God willing." Clara sat with that notebook until the lantern burned low, understanding at last why the old women of the town had looked at her so strangely when she was a child, why her grandfather's name had never quite escaped the shadow of suspicion, despite 30 years of honorable service. And understanding, too, with a grief so sharp it stole her breath, that he had likely died not from any accident on those stairs, but because someone had discovered what he knew before he ever reached Judge Alcott. She spent the following week searching every inch of the lighthouse with the patience her grandfather himself had taught her, running her hands along stone joints, tapping floorboards, listening for the particular hollow sound that meant a space where no space should be, until she found it. A section of the cellar floor beneath the old cistern, its mortar subtly different from the stone around it, cut and refitted by careful hands. It took her the better part of a day with a borrowed pry bar to lift the slab, and when she finally did, lowering her lantern into the dark space beneath, she found a second strongbox, iron-banded and padlocked, and beside it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had somehow kept the salt damp at bay, a leather satchel heavy enough to require both her hands to lift. Inside the satchel, gleaming dull gold in the lantern light, lay coin after coin, the missing payroll, exactly as her grandfather's log had promised, along with a sealed packet of papers that, when Clara carefully unfolded them with trembling fingers, contained the torn manifest page, the dockhand's written testimony, and a final letter in Eli Boone's own hand, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had written it simply to leave the truth behind him in case he never got the chance to speak it aloud. "I have done what I can. If I do not live to see this righted, let whoever finds it know that Thaddeus Prout stole from the dead and the grieving, and that the men of the Meridian and their families deserve what is theirs. Let it be given back, whatever the cost." For 3 days Clara told no one what she had found, sitting with the gold and the papers spread before her on the keeper's table, understanding the weight of what had landed in her hands. She was 16 years old, penniless, cast out, and she now possessed both a fortune and a truth that could destroy the reputation of the most powerful family on that stretch of coast. The family that had, without knowing the irony of it, cast her out themselves not 3 weeks before. She thought of simply keeping the gold, of using it to build a life far from Widow's Point where no one would ever ask her name or her history again, and she would not have blamed herself entirely for wanting that. But she thought too of her grandfather's careful hand writing "Let it be given back, whatever the cost," and she thought of the 40 families who had gone without a season's wages 11 years before, some of whom, she now understood, still lived in Widow's Point in modest circumstances that might have looked very different had that payroll ever reached them. She decided, sitting alone in the lamp room with the gray dawn breaking over the water, that she would not keep a single coin of it for herself beyond what honest wages might earn her, and that she would see her grandfather's name cleared, and the town's true history brought into the light, even if it meant standing alone against Silas Prout and everything his family's money could buy. She began carefully, first seeking out old Cyrus Tate, the fisherman who had teased her at the auction, because she remembered her grandfather once mentioning him as a young dockhand on the Meridian's loading crew, and she found, when she showed him the torn manifest page, that his face went pale and still, and that he confirmed, in a voice roughened with long-buried anger, that the cargo he had loaded that November night had indeed been heavier and more valuable than what the official records ever showed, and that he had always wondered in the years since why the payroll his own brother had drowned trying to deliver had never once been mentioned in the settlement the cooperative received. Word moved carefully through Widow's Point after that, the way word does in a small fishing town, from Cyrus to a handful of old families who remembered the Meridian, and Clara found herself, within a fortnight, sitting in modest parlors and dockside kitchens explaining what her grandfather had discovered and what she had found sealed beneath his lighthouse. Not everyone believed her at first. Some were afraid of crossing Silas Prout, whose cannery employed half the town and whose goodwill kept many families fed through hard winters. But enough of them remembered their own fathers and brothers lost or short-changed by the Meridian's wreck, that a quiet current of support began to build beneath the town's respectable surface, the kind of current that does not announce itself until it is already strong enough to move against the tide. Silas Prout did not remain ignorant of what was stirring for long. Within a month of her discovery, Clara received a visit at the lighthouse from Silas himself, arriving by hired boat with an expression of controlled fury she had never once seen him wear in 4 years under his roof. He told her plainly that whatever she believed she had found, whatever old grudges her grandfather had nursed against his father, she would be wise to let sleeping matters lie, reminding her, not gently, that she was a girl of 16 with no family, no standing, and no proof that would hold against the word of a man who sat on the town council and had, in fact, quietly funded the very church where half the town worshipped each Sunday. Clara, who had spent weeks steeling herself for exactly this confrontation, met his eyes without flinching and told him that she had proof enough, the manifest, the testimony, the gold itself, still sealed and untouched beneath the lighthouse floor, and that she intended to bring it before Judge Alcott's successor, a younger magistrate named Judge Harlan Reeves, who had a reputation, unlike his predecessor, for taking evidence over influence. Silas's composure cracked only slightly at the mention of the gold, and in that small crack Clara saw confirmation of everything her grandfather's log had implied. He left the lighthouse that day with a threat wrapped in smooth civility, warning her that a girl who made enemies of powerful men often found her welcome in a small town growing very thin indeed. And in the weeks that followed, Clara felt the pressure of that warning in small, deniable ways. A shopkeeper who suddenly had no work for her mending, a boatman who claimed he could no longer spare the time to ferry her to and from the mainland. Whispers that reached her ears suggesting the girl at the lighthouse was unbalanced by grief, chasing ghosts and old scandals to make herself important. It would have been easy in those weeks for Clara to lose her nerve entirely, alone as she was on her wind-scoured rock with a fortune she dared not spend, and a truth no one in power wanted spoken. But she thought each night of her grandfather climbing those same stairs for 30 years, tending a light that guided other men safely home. And she understood that the whole shape of his life had been an argument for showing up faithfully, even when no one was watching or grateful, and she resolved to do the same. It was Cyrus Tate, in the end, who helped tip the balance, gathering a dozen of the old fishing families whose fathers or grandfathers had sailed on or been owed by the Meridian, and standing with Clara before Judge Reeves in the county seat on a bright, cold morning in November. 11 years, almost to the week, from the night the meridian went down. Clara laid out the evidence herself, her voice steady though her hands trembled beneath the table. Her grandfather's log, the torn manifest, Cyrus's sworn testimony, and finally the gold itself, carried into the courtroom in the same oiled canvas satchel in which it had lain hidden for over a decade, its weight settling onto the judge's bench with a sound that seemed to silence the entire room. Judge Reeves examined the manifest page against the shipping company's original filings, still on record at the county office, and found, as Eli Boone had found 11 years before him, that the numbers did not match, that a fortune had been claimed as lost that had, in fact, been quietly rowed ashore before the meridian ever struck the rocks. Silas Prout, summoned to answer for his father's dealings and his own long silence in the face of what he must have long suspected, could offer no honest denial that satisfied the judge. And though the elder Thaddeus Prout was 15 years in his grave and beyond the reach of any earthly court, the judge ordered the recovered gold distributed, with interest calculated as fairly as the county records allowed, to the surviving families of the Meridian's crew and to the cooperative that had gone unpaid, and further ordered a public correction to the town's records clearing Eli Boone's name of the negligence long, unfairly, laid at his door. Silas Prout, his reputation now indelibly stained by his father's long-hidden theft, and his own evident willingness to let an innocent man's memory bear the blame for it, found the town's goodwill, the very currency his cannery and his standing had always depended on, evaporating in the weeks that followed with a speed that no amount of money could arrest. Men who had once tipped their hats to him now looked past him on the street, and within the year he had quietly sold his interest in the cannery and left Widow's Point altogether, seeking, perhaps, a town where his name did not yet carry the weight of what had been uncovered. Clara Boone, meanwhile, found herself standing where she had never expected to stand, not simply cleared of the town's earlier pity, but held in a kind of quiet, hard-won respect that no inheritance could have purchased so honestly. She did not keep the gold, true to the promise she had made herself in the lamp room that gray dawn, but she did accept, at the insistence of the families she had helped make whole, a small portion set aside in gratitude, enough to see the lighthouse properly repaired and re-roofed, its lamp cleaned and its mechanism oiled back into working order. And though the coast no longer needed Gull Rock's light for its ships, Clara relit it anyway, one clear evening the following spring, simply because it felt to her like the right thing to do, a small stubborn flame answering the darkness the way her grandfather always had. She thought, as she stood in the lamp room watching that light sweep once more across the black water, of the girl she had been 11 months before, 16, homeless, laughed at on the wharf for spending her last $9 on a pile of stones no one else wanted. And she understood now that she had not been a fool that morning at all, only faithful to something she could not yet name. The same quiet faith her grandfather had carried up those spiral stairs every night of his working life. She had bought for $9, not merely a ruined lighthouse but the unfinished work of a good man's life. And in finishing it, she had restored not only his name but the fortunes of families who had suffered in silence for over a decade. And she had done it not through cleverness or luck alone, but through the same simple creed Eli Boone had taught her on the tide pools of her childhood. That worth is measured by what you are willing to give away when no one is watching, and that the sea and the truth eventually reward those who show them respect. Clara Boone lived out the better part of her life at that lighthouse on Gull Rock, and though offers came, in later years, for her to sell the property to wealthier buyers who saw only its picturesque value, she never once considered it, keeping the light burning long after any ship required it, a private and enduring monument to a grandfather who had died trying to do right by strangers, and to a granddaughter who had finished what he started. The town of Widow's Point never forgot the winter a homeless girl bought a cursed lighthouse for $9, and in doing so, gave back to them a truth and a fortune they had long since given up hoping to recover. And generations later, The families of the Meridian's lost crew still spoke of Clara Boone the way her grandfather had once been spoken of in careful, respectful whispers, not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as the quiet, steady center of their own. Thank you for spending this time with Clara's story, and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need the reminder that value is so often hiding in the places others have already given up on. We'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had written off? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we're always glad to hear from you. Until next time, stay close.